It's my enormous pleasure today to introduce you the Honourable Richard Lawless. Mr. Lawless has dedicated over 20 years of his life to public service of his country, which is focused mainly on national security issues. And this started with a tour of Korea for the US Army, where he worked in intelligence roles. He then transitioned to the Central Intelligence Agencies, where he did multiple overseas tours at a time where working at the DO, the Directorate of Operations, was incredibly risky at the height of the Cold War, where again, he did a lot of Asian issues and also a lot of technology issues, from what I understand from the declassified parts of his CV. He then, his success in these roles and in some private sector roles led to his appointment as the Deputy, I've got to get it right, the Deputy Director of, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, where again, his experience on Asian and Pacific issues was taken hold of, and in particular, his ability to work on technology issues. And in that role, he played a number of important, he behind the scenes, he did a lot of important features that related to US-Korea alliance issues, non-proliferation issues, and broader East Asian and Southeast Asian security. After 2007, just to show just how broad his experience is, he left and he served on the board of a number of private companies and founded his own private company, working in a number of areas related to technology. Most recently, he's been working on the board of Texas Central Partners, which does, from what I understand, rail technologies, high-speed rail technologies in the Texas area. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Lawless, who, on a personal note, I spent a lot of time in DC, and even now, 20 years after he left, people still talk about the great work that he did during his time at Defense. And so today he will be presenting his thoughts on nuclear North Korea and Japan, and presenting the case for the INF option. Please take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for being with us today. I commented to the interlocutors that I realize I stand between you and your lunch. It's 11 o'clock your time, and so I'll try to be as efficient as possible in moving through this. One of the requests I had was to briefly mention NPEC and the fine work they do, and encourage you to interact with them. Henry Sokowski has this nonprofit in Washington, D.C. It does an excellent job of educating, we'll say next gen, but also current generation incoming folks on the whole topic of nonproliferation from both a lay technical aspect and also a policy aspect. They run courses multiple times a year and typically have probably 20 or so people, half of them first term or second term congressional staffers, and a mix of other folks. But it's a nonprofit program that he manages, and it's really been interesting to see over the years that people come out of that and go into both arms control roles, non-proliferation roles within State Department and Defense Department and other locations, but especially the impact on congressional staffers. The other thing I'll mention is they do a weekly newsletter that comes out every Friday afternoon. It's sort of an eclectic compendium of arms control and nuclear proliferation issues. It's something you can subscribe to from NPEC. And I always find one or two nuggets among the 20 or so stories that they profile and provide links to. So with that, I'll just say I appreciate the fine work that NPEC does, and I thank them for bringing us together today with UC San Diego. Moving into a reference to the document that some of you have seen, or I hope several of you have seen, that appeared in January in the Japanese magazine Wedge in Japanese, and then was subsequently published in English. There have been other shorter versions of it published. The National Bureau of Asia Research did a truncated version of it. That's a few other places have repeated it, but the full version of this is the document that I'm referring to today. And I would like to just begin by overviewing that document quickly. I know that I've been given about 25 minutes now, going on 20 to do so. But one of the questions that was put to me today, this morning, was, why did you write it? You're not out of the academic world. You're certainly not an ongoing policy wonk in Washington, D.C., associated with one of the research institutes. And I think the answer to that is, why did I write it? I think there's really 4 reasons very quickly, and that shows, I guess, the motivation of trying to get these thoughts down. Was number one, a lot of conversations over the last few years in Japan, but particularly the last year or so in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, in which folks really believe that we were not looking far enough or more broadly enough as to what the implications were and the second and third order effects of the North Korean nuclear weapons program for the stability of Northeast Asia. So that got me thinking about a lot of things. Secondly, another motivation was my own frustration over US policy failures over really 4 different administrations, beginning with the Clinton administration and the agreed framework. My personal experience in the Bush 43 administration, which was very frustrating. Of course, in the Obama and again in the Trump administration. I just watched US policy roam and in many cases avoid the obvious. A third reason was I believe that the North Korean nuclear program will cause further devolution and further problems in the region in Northeast Asia. And I think we need to do a better job of looking at all the implications of it, putting a timeline on some events that may or may not happen, and deal with these issues honestly. The last issue, the reason I think motivation, and maybe as a former career intelligence officer, particularly on the collection side, I've been very disillusioned by the poor quality of intelligence analysis that address this issue. And of course, as I mentioned in the document itself, policymakers make decisions based on what the intelligence analysis puts in front of them as the most likely current situation and the most likely evolution. And this is what brought me into a lot of activity with NPIC, because I certainly saw multiple fails, sustained failures on the part of the intelligence community in judging the pace and the sophistication and the determination of the North Korean nuclear program. I saw it in Vienna, Austria, at IAEA. I saw it years later in the Pentagon. And for me, it was extremely frustrating to realize that policymakers were not getting, I didn't believe, the benefit of cogent intelligence analysis. On the paper itself, what I attempted to do was look at the impact first, the current situation and the impact of the North Korean nuclear weapons program on, I guess, 5 separate relationships or 5 separate trains of events in Northeast Asia. In the course of the paper, I talk about the North Korea ROK relationship, shifting from one of increased dominance by the North Koreans over the South. I talk about the role of China, which I call in the paper an abetting complacency vis-a-vis North Korea. That's a story in and of itself. We could probably spend hours just on that topic, but I do blame China and its inability, unwillingness to address the North Korean nuclear issue. I also talk about the 6-party talks and the events within those 6-party talks, and seeing all this play out firsthand, and the exchanges or the differing perspectives and priorities among those 6 parties in attendance at the Beijing meetings over the course of 2 years. I also talk about, I think, the coming back in the paper to the situation the Republic of Korea faces by its being increasingly marginalized in this relationship, particularly by the North Koreans, who are inclined to disregard their fellow Koreans to the south, disrespect them, and seek other avenues of approach to the United States. And then I think one of the penultimate destinations of the paper is the impact on Japan and how this influences the future course of the U.S.-Japan alliance. The second half of the paper talks about, I guess, what would be a reasonable response, particularly in light of where we think this program is going to go. I begin going all the way back to the beginning of the paper to say there has been a reluctance, a sustained reluctance to not admit or not deal factually or logically with the fact that North Korea is not only a declared nuclear weapon state, but also an increasingly sophisticated one. And we have had policy issues, including my time in the Bush administration, where a policy decision was simply to say, we will never accept a nuclear North Korea. Ridiculous. I mean, North Korea has had a nuclear weapons capability for years. And it's that type of a mentality of whistling past the graveyard that, again, frustrated me and continues to frustrate me. I think we're getting more realistic about it now, but it's been a very slow process. With regard to the response, I think the balance of the paper makes a case, in fact, I hope it does, that one response that would serve a number of purposes and actually be self-reinforcing, if you will, and also logical, is a deployment on the ground in Japan of a INF capability. I mentioned the experience with Germany, where we have a two key jointly owned, jointly deployed, jointly managed force that is both nuclear and conventional. And I think there is a certain logic to revisiting INF in a US-Japan alliance relationship. I think I identify four positive reasons which I believe are compelling and complementary. And those are, first, I think it offers credibility to the US-Japan alliance. It is an alliance that has from time to time been questioned. Our credibility, our staying power, particularly during the Trump administration, but also during other administrations where we seem to have either taken the relationship for granted or put a price on it that the Japanese may not have been willing to pay, literally, or may not be able to pay politically. So I think there is real logic in credibly strengthening the US-Japan relationship and basically exchanging an INF dual key capability deployed system and in a sense, providing long-term realistic credibility to the alliance. I think that a second complementary reason is that it sends a message to any potentially hostile power in the region, be it North Korea, be it China, be it Russia, that make no mistake about it, we are deterring aggression against Japan or against the alliance for as long as that INF force is present. My personal observation is that in a sense, we reassure the Japanese that we have a strategic asset forward deployed in Japan that should provide that deterrence. That namely is the carrier battle group that's there, the nuclear carrier battle group. It's the only place outside the United States of America that such a capability is deployed. But that said, we have sent mixed signals, and not only to Japan, but to the entire region as to the sustainability and the credibility, the responsiveness of the United States to aggression against Japan. I think a third reason is permanently, at least for the life of any joint deployment, INF deployment, we will be able to aggressively and totally dissuade Japan from its own nuclear option. And I know that people always say, or many people say, especially what I call the chrysanthemum club of folks that have a particular predilection toward Japan, which is fine, that is completely impossible that Japan would ever do such a thing. That is, develop its own nuclear capability. The bottom line is anything can happen, and Japan has the technical capability and it has the fissile material to become a nuclear weapon state in a matter of a very short period of time. And I argue in the paper that if the US alliance is not credible, Japan will in fact have no choice but to seriously examine that option. So again, I think an INF deployment, which we control, the United States has a measure of control over, a heavy measure of control, will permanently dissuade and prevent Japan from even thinking about going in that direction. My last point is, I think an INF deployment in Japan would actually have a very positive influence on bringing China into an active discussion about an international INF convention, returning to an INF world, if you will. The fact of the matter is, right now, there's absolutely no reason for for China to become part of a INF regime. And in fact, China's unwillingness to do so, combined with its INF capabilities, is the very reason why neither the Russians nor the United States found it practical to go forward with an INF regime. We don't have an INF regime, and I think the only way we'll ever get back into one is if we bring China into it. And this may, in fact, be a forcing function that helps us do that with China. The last part of the paper is a view from Pyongyang. And I would say maybe the most important element, understated perhaps in that paper, the two paragraphs that begin with the phrase, as a direct consequence of this experience. And what I'm saying here is North Korea and the United States have a very special relationship. And there is a lot of history there, but there's a lot of potential there. And the fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, or the North Koreans like it, or whether the South Koreans or the Chinese approve of it, we are, the United States, the only potential guarantor of the survival of North Korea, both as a regime or as a nation state. I believe that. I've seen it in practice. I've seen it across the table in Beijing with the North Koreans. And it's something we sometimes miss. It was something that in his own backward way, Trump tapped into, even though he probably didn't realize that, excuse me. But it's an interesting factoid, if you will. And I just mentioned it in passing in the paper because it may provide a key in the future to do what we have to do to resolve this nuclear issue once and for all.